Have you ever wondered what really separates a simple, tragic mistake from an actual crime? Well, it almost always boils down to just two key ingredients. Today, we're going to break down that essential formula that defines pretty much every single criminal act. I mean, really think about it. Imagine a driver hits a patch of black ice, swerves, and causes a terrible accident. Now picture another driver who, in a fit of rage, deliberately rams their car into someone else's. Both scenarios can cause serious harm, right? But in the eyes of the law, they are worlds apart. And the reason why is all in this specific legal formula. The key to the whole thing goes way back to this ancient Latin legal principle. It says, the act is not guilty unless the mind is also guilty. And that one single idea, it's the absolute bedrock of how we think about crime and justice today. So this principle gives us our two essential ingredients for a crime. First, you've got the Actus Reus, which is the guilty act, and second, you have the Mens Rea, the guilty mind. You need both. To really get how this works, we've got to look at each one up close. Okay, so let's start with ingredient number one, the part that's usually the most obvious, the physical act itself, the Actus Reus. So Actus Reus is just the actual physical thing that the law says you can't do. And the key word here, you got to remember this, is voluntary. It has to be a conscious physical action. So, an involuntary muscle spasm that hits someone, or something you do while sleepwalking, that's generally not going to count as a guilty act. Now, this guilty act can actually show up in a few different ways. The most straightforward is a direct action, like physically pulling a trigger. But, and this is interesting, it can also be an omission, which is a failure to act when you're legally required to. Think of a parent who has a duty to feed their child and doesn't. And finally, for some crimes, the Actus Reus is defined by the result, like the death that happens in a murder case. So, to make this super simple, let's take a case of battery. The Actus Reus is easy. It's the physical act of actually hitting the other person. It's the what of the crime, plain and simple. All right, so that's the physical part. Now let's move on to the second ingredient, which is often way more complex, the mens rea, or the guilty mind. This gets into the why behind the act. Mens rea is all about what was going on in the defendant's head when they committed the act. What was their intention? How aware were they of the risks? This is the element that really draws that bright line between a pure accident and a punishable crime. But here's the thing, not all guilty minds are the same. The law actually has this whole hierarchy of blame. At the very top, you have intention. This is when your goal was to commit the act and cause the harm. Right below that is knowledge, where you were practically certain your actions would cause that result. Then you've got recklessness, where you knew there was a huge risk, but you just ignored it and did it anyway. And all the way at the bottom is negligence, where you didn't see a risk that any other reasonable person would have. And the level of mens rea, that can be the difference between a slap on the wrist and years in prison. So let's jump back to our battery example. The Actus Reus was the punch, right? The physical act. Well, the mens rea is the intention to actually make that contact and cause harm. It's the I meant to do that part of the whole equation. So here it is, the big takeaway. You cannot have a crime without both of these ingredients. They have to happen together. First, you absolutely have to have the guilty physical act. And that act has to be paired with a guilty mental state. And only when those two things lock together, only then do you actually have the foundation for a crime. The act by itself isn't enough, and just having a bad thought isn't either. And there's one last little piece to this puzzle we got to talk about. Concurrence. It's a simple idea, really. It just means the guilty mind and the guilty act have to happen at the same time. The intent has to be what drives the action. They can't just be two separate events. So, you might be thinking, okay, two old Latin terms, why is this such a big deal? Well, this formula isn't just some dusty legal jargon. It has a massive impact on real-world justice every single day. This whole framework is really the cornerstone of a fair justice system. It's how we tell the difference between a tragedy and a crime. It's what makes sure the punishment actually fits the level of intent, not just the outcome. And importantly, it puts a really high bar on prosecutors. They have to prove both what a person did and what they were thinking beyond a reasonable doubt. And all this brings us to a final, really challenging question. We saw that failing to act can be a crime if you have a legal duty, like a parent or a lifeguard. But that opens up a much bigger question for all of us, doesn't it? As a society, where do we draw that line? Should you or I have a legal duty to help a total stranger who's in danger? It's a tough one, and there are no easy answers. Thanks for digging into this with us.